Yeah, so I was saying to you in the email that I've been reading more. Well, I've been reading this guy Manuel de Landa, who's talking about Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the assemblage, and an assemblage being essentially the something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So de Landa has kind of taken. So in Deleuze and Guattari, there's assemblages and there's strata, but de Landa is kind of saying no, these are. Imagine you've got an organism or you've got an entity and it's got two knobs attached, and one of them is territorialization and one of them is codification. And when you turn codification up to the maximum, it becomes a strata. So an assemblage, it can be more territorialized, which you can think of territorialization as the kind of reputational storage of our reputations, the duties that we're bound to have, the interactions that we have that bring us more and more together. And these are more organic things, like we had an email saying we'd talk at this time, so I was like, okay, I better show up at this time, otherwise there's going to be some kind of reputational cost there. Mm-hmm. Even though technically you could say there'd be no cost, but there is a cost. So there's kind of there's these chains that bind us that are loose, but it's not codified. So the codified would be the 10 commandments. It's the regulations. It's the you have to follow this or else there's a sort of threat of punishment.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's what seems to have happened is the deterritorialization, like with territorialization now, has just been turned down to the maximum. So you've got, rather than this super hierarchical thing in medieval, and sure, power was decentralized, but it was very clear where the hierarchy lay, and you come all the way up to the king. And as you were saying earlier, there was this nakedness to the power. Mm-hmm. And so that was highly structured, it was clear that this entire thing worked as a whole. Whereas now, with the rise of, what I've been exploring recently is with the rise of equality, the idea of egalitarianism and democracy obviously just being an embodiment of that. You've just got the entire thing pulling apart. And now, instead of all of us playing the same power game, there's a sort of a disintegration into these echo chambers, into these subcultures, and then these are kind of going to war. And so the entire culture is fighting for something that's unclear. Is it are they fighting to be king of the hill? Are we fighting to have our agenda held over the rest of society, and so we're trying to dominate the others, or what's going on? But it seems rather than having an assemblage of a nation or a society, we've got all these individual wholes. Like we're getting, and we seem to be in multiple ones at once. So you could say there's the 4chan kind of group in one sort of assemblage. You've got the leftists of Tumblr kind of emerging onto Twitter in another one. But then once they're on Twitter, you've just got this, well, what is Twitter the free speech party for the free speech institution? That was what the head of Twitter said back in 2012, and then it just became, well, this is not free speech. So it just seems, there's a vastness to power, but it seems to be disintegrating. And so the McLuhan thing seems to hit something, even though obviously he's not talking about the internet. There seems to be something even more, I don't know, poignant about that, where there's just this increasing fragmentation, and it's hard to tell if it's these high ideals and the world is becoming better, more equality, more freedom, more rights, but then it's also leading to, I think there's an instability in the system because it's not rigid enough. And I'm wondering whether a more rigid power system will emerge, and this kind of comes through the idea of liminality, of this structure, and then structure kind of breaks down, and you've got this fluid part where in ritualistic and tribal ritualistic settings, this is where this originally comes from with Victor Turner's work. You've got the structure of like rigid hierarchy and rigid structures and roles that everyone plays. You go through a liminal ritual in which your role is changed. So you go from being a boy to being a man. You go from being a normal person into being an elder, or into being the not king but the chief. And then, but structure is always at the other end of that in-between liminal phase. And the liminality is treated like, it's like a decontamination chamber. Like you spend 2 weeks apart from the tribe in between, and 2 weeks or up to 2 months apart from the tribe after. So there's like this, we don't want someone that's tainted with the freedom and liberalism of this liminal state to come back to structure. So you want to come down from that ecstatic high of that experience, And I'm wondering whether all of modernity has just been this ecstatic liminal phase. And while capitalistic bourgeois modernity can outcompete any other form of societal structure, it seems, although China is ambiguous as to whether, but still, but yeah, I'm wondering whether the structure has to bounce back at some point, and whether it's evolutionarily more adaptive and can outcompete in the short term, but whether long term it's doomed to like disintegrate and to fall into some sort of, we can call it a dark age, but back into a more rigidly structured thing. So it's like a game of musical chairs, and you just wait until the end, and then this is the person who's got, this is the new oligarchy that's going to hold power for a long time after.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's kind of the angles that I'm approaching it with at the moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing with these questions is as well that to bring it back as well to the elite theory is that they don't. That's another example where elite theory wouldn't actually make any distinction between now, for example, China or bourgeois capitalism or whatever else, even between the West and the Soviet Union, they would refer to all of this as a sort of managerial system or managerial bureaucracy with different flavors of that, right? With just different ways of managerialism, right?
So, but is that a bracket in it for the sake of a particular type of analysis, or is that a dismissal of those distinctions? Is it saying these distinctions are trivial, or is it saying these distinctions are not what we're studying? They're not relevant to the particular analysis of. Yeah, it's not. Are they saying it's not relevant to power at all, or just to this variation of power, this element of power that we're trying to like hone in on, which is the elite element?
Yeah, it's not what it's more to say it's not what we're studying, but it's also it focuses on doing the right distinctions, right? So like there is a managerial class, a managerial bureaucratic class. They actually are what comes after the classic bourgeois capitalism. The classic bourgeois capitalism is, so to say, a ghost or like an image of the past, which has been replaced latest in the early 20th century, if not before that, because you see, especially with things like the New Deal in the United States, you see actually big government driving a lot of things, driving the development of the internet, driving the development of the whole modern national security state that we know nowadays. All of these.
But is that just not just as long as Keynesian economics was ruling? Keynesian?
Yeah, you could say, but Keynesian, you can see that actually as a sort of part of managerial ideology, right?
But then with the emergence of neoliberalism in the 1980s, are we not seeing that big system has kind of collapsed, and then there's been a deterritorialization and a release of energies, or what do you see there?
Well, I mean, the let's say that the ruling class in the quote unquote neoliberal age would be seen as something like a managerial class as well. It is no longer the driving powerful class is no longer proprietors. It's no longer people who own certain shares or own something. It's the administrators, the managers. That is the claim there, and that hasn't really changed. That it's again a kind of internal reform within a managerial class, but one has not treated the other as a partisan enemy in the Schmittian sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But power is still shifted. So like the dynamics, because it just seems to me of like, speaking about a managerial class, I mean, could you not describe chiefs and elders as a managerial class?
Well, I mean, it depends on how much you want to stretch out certain definitions, right? It's just like people speaking about ideologies in antiquity. It's like, do you want to use the term like that, or do you want to claim ideology is something that came about after the end of religion, dominating our societies? And it's the same thing with the managerial class talk, right? It's in its definition, and people like Burnham, with people like Burnham or Sam Francis, I think it's more focused on distinguishing the current elite from the preceding elite, which is this classical bourgeois capitalist elite, right?
So
Whereas
the managerial class is seen as this new thing since the 1920s, this since New Deal Keynesian kind of emergence of that economic model. That was
yes,
a qualitative shift from bourgeois capitalism into something more managerial.
Yes, it's kind of, if you look at especially in the 1920s, if you look at scientists in the time, there was this movie Oppenheimer was out recently.
Mm-hmm.
The smartest people were like communists, they were Marxists, communists, the smartest academics and scientists and whatever they were, and these people were given responsibilities, governing responsibilities, especially in the 20s, 30s, and then officially basically became like the economy became something that was managed by the state to a large extent in the New Deal, and it was managed to a large extent in the Soviet Union, but it was a different kind of managerial policy, you could say, but it was nonetheless a sort of managerial bureaucracy, right? Which was different from a state that was mainly there for, internal security, maintaining contracts and all that, right?
So the argument would be that that like that Soviet state and the New Deal state are more alike to each other than would say the New Deal state is to the bourgeois capitalist state that preceded it.
Yes, or for example, the what's it called, the Wilhelm Empire in Germany, which was like a bit of a hybrid. It was trying to catch up with it was trying to catch up with industrialization, so they kind of did engage in some sort of managerial activity, but still trying to keep it under a medieval style empire umbrella, right?
Is this Prussian Empire, like late 19th century, or what do we?
Yeah,
what?
yeah. 1871 to 1919, that ended in the First World War, right?
Right, yeah.
For example, right? And then you had a Western style. You could say then you have the extreme form of like a wild bourgeois economy with the Weimar Republic, and then turning into a hybrid. Germany is always like Germany's always hated for people who make theories like this, because they always fall out of these categories. They don't fit neatly into these categories, because on the one hand they didn't engage in the same development at the same time as Britain, United States, and all that. And on the other hand, they always caught up with it either quickly or caught up so quickly that they overtook them in some parts, right? But then used it for other purposes, just like in the Prussian Empire, basically building up a modern state under the umbrella of a medieval structure, you could say. And then in the Third Reich, basically building up a managerial state, a fully, you could say, modern managerial state, but weaponizing it for a very archaic pre-modern value, right? Tribal value, you could say.
So let's where does the Third Reich kind of come into this? Is that different in terms of these forms of power, in terms of the managerial thing? Is that something different?
It's you would see it as different, and like that would kind of, it's always difficult to not engage in post hoc rationalization of history, right? But that would kind of explain the alliance against the Third Reich, for example. It would argue that it is, to some extent, a managerial state as well, but it kind of used, just in parts, it used this sort of system as a weapon to actually smash the goals of modernity, against the goals of modernity.
So the managerial state is kind of about the fulfillment of the goals of modernity. It's very much an Enlightenment era kind of project.
Yes, you could say, you could see it in a Hegelian dialectical way, right? The managerial state is the synthesis of a bourgeois capitalism and a rising Marxist socialist ideology, right? and none of them can exist in its pure form, and then they kind of synthesize into this managerial system, right?
Mm.
And yeah, and
But
essentially,
what was going on before the 1920s then? Because I guess I'm not fully understanding how these what shifted that was so dramatic. Were there no so obviously regulation is one element of it, the state taking more power with New Deal and taking more power over the economy, and also bringing in, I guess, social welfare programs. Is that kind of the big change of like the introduction of these? It's not just everyone fending for themselves. We're actually big brother or big daddy, and we're gonna like look after you a little bit and kind of like prepare you to be the best to have this whole assemblage work best together.
yeah, I mean, if we stick to this Machiavellian scheme, then you can't actually give proper analytical reasons for why it's A led to B. You can only give, you can only speak in these historical patterns. So for example, if another elite comes to power, it would often be due to the former enemy having been defeated, you could say, and there being no chance of um there being no way of the um maintaining the
Keep
political
your
formula.
concentration.
Yeah.
The multitasking not working.
Yeah. Maintaining the what's it called, the political formula I spoke about earlier. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, you have a political formula that justifies having a particular enemy, but if it's that enemy is not believable anymore, right? If that enemy is kind of already defeated, the political formula loses its effect, and then the current justification for the current rule also loses its effect. So in that sense, you could say, why did the regular bourgeois capitalist class, why did that go away? You can It's basically because their enemy had been defeated. It couldn't really mobilize people by revolting against the nobility and the church. That didn't
Mm,
work anymore. The nobility and the church had already become irrelevant, right?
mm.
And especially in a country like the United States. And so then at that point it would just be too weak. It was just weak enough to then be replaced at some
It
point.
couldn't serve as a, yeah, yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, at some point, you have if you have huge investors basically in Washington, New York, whatever, basically buying up politics like a mafia, then it's you can't really justify that well anymore with the fact that they revolted against the British Empire 200 years ago or something.
Mm,
That's not really, the political formula doesn't work anymore. And then
yeah,
you
yeah.
had the successive regulation and removal of these positions of power and replacement with professional lobbyists, professional bureaucrats, professional, right?
Mm,
And that's how it gave rise to that. And there's no
yeah.
specific analytic systemic explanation to that. It's just kind of the way the cycle goes, right? At some point, um managerialism will also have run its course, right?
So I'm curious to see where you think fascism would fit in this mold. Obviously, there is a very large state element involved, and that it's kind of a massive New Deal project in a way, kind of bigger than the
Yep.
New Deal. Um,
Yeah. Joseph
but
Goebbels famously praised Franklin Roosevelt as well.
yeah,
um
it's all yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, it is a special case in that sense that it represents just like the Soviet Union or the United States, or it represents a form of managerialism. It represents a flavor of managerialism, you could say. Only that it often is particularized. It is often particular to a certain value. Either it's particular to this superior race, you could say, or it's particular
mm,
to this people, to this religion. You can have religious theocracy, theocratic fascism, whatever.
mm,
It's often particularized, and then this particularization often refers to a value that is pre-modern, which the other versions that won in the world wars aren't. And arguably, that is the reason why they won, right? Because
What do you mean?
you kind of have to, from the view of a fascist, you're making a deal with the devil in a sense. You kind of have to, you're employing the methods of modernity in order to defend a pre-modern value, a value that was actually that modernity is fighting against. So you're kind of,
What do you think that value is? Like what do you mean there?
well, for example, the coherency of a people tied to blood and soil, where you could say radical territorialization, right?
Mm.
Which maybe to some extent was common, not common because of the lack of technology pre-modernity, and that is no longer feasible. Both the Soviet Union as well as the United States are a very international, multicultural state. I mean, obviously a lot of problems, obviously, especially in the United States, there was historically a dominance of a particular demographic, whatever, white male Christian, and you can see now with the managerial class that this original imperial colonial white male demographic has become the icon of the partisan enemy that it seeks to destroy. And the culture wars I would see as a symptom of the fact that that enemy is becoming less credible, right?
The idea of white man,
The white
powerful white man.
colonial, yeah, the powerful white colonials, it's becoming less credible the more the only ones remaining with that kind of power are very old, right?
Mm.
Right. And the more the successive managerial leaders are no longer fit into that category, right?
Yeah, I'm really curious about the fascist thing. So there's two different directions of going here. So one direction that occurs to me is, yeah, I kind of want to follow that. I'm fascinated by the fascist thing at the moment because I really see that energy rising again in the form of populism, obviously stripped of the militia element. But there is some kind of I don't know, did you hear about the riots in Ireland last
Yes.
week?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a massive anti-immigration thing, and it seems to be spreading, but silently. So I have a friend he'd be a tradesman, so he'd be going around to random people's houses, doing work on their houses, and he said there's a lot of talk. Like he goes to a lot of different places, a lot of different people talking in this way of just this thing of like, oh, you can't say this in polite society, but and so it seems like there's an energy spreading, and kind of like Brexit or Trump, it's not going to show up in any polls. And so there's like this demon. Remember, Jung characterized what was going on in the German psyche as the blonde beast in the underground prison. And that seems to be sort of awakening. And you could see Trump, you could see Brexit, you could see these anti globalized kind of movements. And I think there's a big rise in anti-globalization, which seems to be tilting us back towards a reterritorialization. I think the mental health crisis coming from a massive deterritorialization where we're too free, where we don't we're free and we're in competition with a million different people on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. And so there's this death of community, there's the death of connection to something solid and tangible rather than being drawn into this abstract space. Yeah. And so it seems like fascism, while appealing to a pre-modern, I would argue not you could call it pre-modern, but that suggests that it's inherently reactionary or regressive rather than trying to get back to something that's missing. And so I think that there's something in that space that's waking up, and it fascinates me because, first of all, it's terrifying because I've been learning. So oxytocin, the popularly known as the cuddle hormone. It's a neurochemical. Yeah. It's also the genocide hormone. So it's okay. It's basically the in-group out-group dynamics. So the more oxytocin you feel, the more that it's released, the tighter your in-group is, meaning the more out the out-group is.
Right.
And I think I've been playing around with the idea that what was happening in fascist societies is that the oxytocin levels rose massively as the sense of community and this bonding together into the in-group got so tight. But maybe that only got so tight because of the out-group. You know, the out-group was always a very strong element for the previous, 10 centuries, I guess. So there's that tension of like, okay, is it an in-group, out-group thing? And so if this thing is going to emerge again, you're only going to see, is it going to bring a similar level of out-group dynamics, which is terrifying. But I also, looking at the mental health crisis, looking at the state of society and this disintegration and fragmentation, I feel like there's something in that. There's a baby in that bathwater of like, we need a greater community. We need a greater reunifying if this system is going to have any kind of longevity, because it seems like there's too many interests pulling it in too many different ways. The fragmentation is leading to a load of smaller tribes just warring with each other. And it kind of brings to mind like ancient Greece. You know, you had Athens and Sparta and Corinth. And then it was just this outsider, Macedonia, who came in and said, you're all fighting amongst yourselves. I'm just going to take over because your fragmentation isn't really serving. This noble ideal that you had that managed to topple the world's greatest empire, let me just swoop in here and take that over from you. And so I wonder whether there's these kind of dynamics at play on some level. The fragmentation, it seems like you're undefeatable when you're Athens or when you're Sparta, you only think in terms of Athens and Sparta. In China and Russia, or China and America, or maybe it's China or America and Russia and China is the new thing. But it just seems like this fragmentation ultimately makes the system weak and doesn't make it last over a long period of time. And so, yeah, I guess I just see all these dynamics coming up, and I'm trying to get more concepts into my mind to try and piece together what the fuck is going on,
right?
And to try and see some of like, okay, what's going to help what, and what are the risks and what are the costs. Because right now it just seems we're in a very delicate historical moment. Like modernity is coming into some kind of a new cyclical thing where there's a dragon beginning to wake up, and it's like, this could be fucking nasty, especially now that we've got nuclear weapons. And the emergence of AI, super technological in the military industrial complex, is also the stakes are much higher this time round. And it's trying to get ahead of that in some way, or trying to see what's coming around the corner based on looking at these historical patterns.
I mean, I think it's always good to look at these paradoxical opposites that are coming together that I mentioned earlier with McLuhan as well. I'd say Deleuze speaks of that as well in the Society of Control, where he says that the society of control is determined by an extreme form of liberation and restriction at the same time. In the same sense, you know, we spoke earlier of decentralization and unification, at the same time centralization and fragmentation. And you can see it in the technology. You could say, for example, the computer is a decentralization of media. You know, you have the internet rising with it, but at the same time, it was a unification of your Walkman and your faxing machine and your whatever calculator and all these things coming together, right? In the same sense, if you look at the movements now, you have a sort of reaction to this globalism, to this, you know, to this global managerial system, you could say, but it's fragmenting in a sense. So like you could say the reaction to it represents a fragmentation of that global system within that global system, right? It's something that's not reversible. They're not going to go back to the national empires of pre-Second World War times or First World War times, right? It's not reversible. It's actually fragmentation of an already successful global takeover, right? And this fragmentation at the same time, you know, happens to be somehow at the same time centralizing in some sense. You know, you're centralizing back together around some sort of common value, common core. And the question here is, you know, is it a sort of, you could say, attempt at reigniting whatever happened with fascism back? Like when I was speaking of fascism earlier, I spoke fascism with a capital F, so the historical fascism, not with a small f, where you could say, you know, in a
the populist term.
More. Is it something like, you know, attempting, and according to, you know, the principles of power, you could say there is no such thing. There's no such turning back. Like if it is something like that, then it's bound to fail. It's bound to be a temporary, temporary upheaval, and then it's over. But however, it could also mean something else.
So is in that perspective, were the fascists destined to lose?
Well, that's a separate question. I'm saying if you're trying to rebuild the fascism that has lost as it was, you are destined to lose.
Oh yeah, okay,
right. Yeah. I would say that's another question, but in some sense you could say yes, because like I said, whilst you could say the Soviet Union and the United States were more pure managerial systems, a lot of the fascist states were kind of hybrids that were at odds, that were internally contradictory in a sense, right? Like I said, because they'd often want to weaponize modernity in order to defend pre-modernity in a sense, right? But coming back to things now, you often see a change of power dynamics alongside a change of the medium, of the dominant mass medium, right? So as power is a medium, the medium is also a medium. It is also a message, right? And you could say that potentially something else is happening. Potentially either the managerial system in itself, or this version or this generation of the managerial system is expiring. Potentially their political formula, the dominant political formula, which you could call woke or wokeism or whatever, is potentially expiring. The bad guy, the villain, the partisan enemy of the woke is no longer credibly a threat. And so they focus more on the rise of right-wing populism, of white supremacy, of whatever, making it still questionable to what extent that rise is actually feasible or happening, the way it existed in the past. I'd be very surprised if any movement would come close to, if any genuinely white supremacist movement would come anywhere close to the ones that existed in the past, right?
Yeah, I don't think white supremacy, but yeah, I guess that would be inherent in the nationalistic and westernized anti-immigration element.
It depends. I suppose I think Ireland is actually a great example of a long tradition of nationalism that was essentially not imperialist and white supremacist. It was actually in resistance to imperialism. You see other examples today as well. You could say Palestinian liberation movement or whatever, or Kurdish. These are nationalisms that are inherently anti-imperialist. So so that's a different topic, but you could say that with the rise of the internet, and that's kind of where this rise of Trump, for example, came from, there may be a new viable, elite coming to power, coming to rise, which, could take a while. We could still be at the beginning or whatever. Something like that could be taking place as the former iteration of the managerial class, or the managerial class itself is kind of running out of steam with its ideological grip through its political formula. You could say the political formula was way more powerful in the times of, you could say classical liberalism, in the times of, what's called civil rights movements and all that. There it had a strong pull to it. And what is left of it, you could say, is this woke culture and the rise of resistance to that online, whether you favor it or don't, is already potentially a symptom of it cracking, of it kind of cracking. But you can't return, the anti-woke, the majority of the anti-woke stuff is not reversing any of the civil rights. They're not in favor of
no, it's
right?
pushing on to something else. It's more concerned with a present war rather than a reactionary, let's go back to 1955 kind of thing.
Yes, and then who knows what emergent technologies will allow for that, will be more efficient, will be more
I mean, if the internet led to first Obama and then Trump, maybe AI will, if all the hype around AI is any bit accurate and that it's going to be as big a shakeup as the internet was, then probably you're going to see another wave in 20, 30 years time of, or maybe in a shorter time window of a completely different upsurge of power. Even as this internet one is still playing itself out, you're going to maybe have this new wave that's going to start interfering. Things are speeding up a lot.
First
And
AI president when it's
yeah,
just all deep fakes. No, he's like the AI president is just like an interview with Tucker Carlson never happened.
deep fakes all the way down.
Deep
Yeah.
fakes all the way. No one notices. They vote for it.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Yeah, I'm sure we could go on like this for hours. We should have another talk before your course though.
Yeah,
It's an interesting. How much of it have you put together? How much is it a work in progress?
yeah, well, I've already, filled my books with a lot of notes. I've read a lot of it. There's still some reading I need to do for it. I want to get into de Juvenel. Bertrand de Juvenel wrote a book called On Power, which I will need to get through. And yeah, I will then soon start setting up, writing the first lectures and recording them. And
That's
yeah,
cool.
and it'll just go along like that. And yeah, then it'll
So you
soon
have
be
all the
officially.
base materials basically. You've basically all the
Yes.
reading done, and now it's
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah,
corralling it
yeah.
into a form. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, we will definitely chat more as that form begins to take place. But are you planning? Did you say earlier June? Were you thinking
Yes,
mid
it's
2024?
presumably June. Well, it hasn't been officially announced at it's at Halcyon Guild again with my colleague and friend Johannes Niederhauser. He runs that, and yeah, it's not officially announced on Halcyon Guild yet, but it will soon, and then people can soon register for that. And yeah, I will be getting into this way more since I'm finished with the current phase of my academic career. I'll be getting more into
Yes.
working on this as well,
Yeah.
doing some more independent stuff. I really do enjoy doing that.
And do you plan on rerunning the course you did last year, the one on the machine?
Probably at some point, yes. Probably at some point, but that's not.
That's not your That's
Yeah,
not on the agenda just yet. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah, and I will, and hopefully we'll get it.